Hey, everybody, and welcome to another lecture in this lecture series for social psychology. Today's video is going to be on stereotypes. So stereotypes is the intro discussion for stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. So while this week is, or these three videos, this one and then the next two in the series are going to be quite heavy considering our current climate. This one is of the lighter variety. But that is not to say that stereotypes are not dangerous or unimportant, right? So there's still something that we need to discuss, and it's still going to be hard to grapple with many of these issues. Okay, so here's the outline, like I've forgotten to do on several videos. Great. So I'm gonna introduce stereotypes. I'm gonna talk about where stereotypes come from, how they're used by people, when they come into play, like what sort of situations, and then what are the consequences for the people who are using the stereotype, but more importantly, the people who are the objects of the stereotypes, the victims of the stereotypes. So we return here to the ABC model of bias, or the CAB model, as I like to say. So we have the C, because it comes first, cognitions. Okay, so we're going to expand on the A and the B after. So it's just the C today. Okay, so stereotypes are beliefs, and we can take those beliefs and call them knowledge structures if you'd like. And belief, if I haven't mentioned it in a video before, a belief is something that you hold to be true regardless of its factual status. So that's when we say that you have a belief of something, it means that it's something that you think is right and true about the world, but is potentially not, because this is irrespective of its factual status, whether or not it is a fact. So the stereotypes, again, are beliefs about personal attributes of a group whereby all or most, this is very important, those two words, all or most members of that group are thought to possess those attributes. Okay, and I'm sure you're familiar with stereotypes as a conversational idea, as a lay idea, as a common discourse feature. So what are the features of stereotypes? Well, they're generally speaking incorrect overgeneralizations. And one of the reasons why we do this, so generalization in general, is for categorization and interpretation purposes. Stereotypes are schemas, just like we've talked about in previous videos. It's much more efficient to deal with novel objects, whether they be animals, inanimate objects, or other people, especially the features of those other people, as category members rather than unique instances. It is far too cognitively complex to isolate every single thing that you come across in your life as a cognitive entity unto itself. And so we have to clump things together. And when we clump things together, the features of those things begin to get generalized. Okay? It allows us to make decisions quickly, and it influences the information that we need to pay attention to, because that's a limited resource. And then what we pay attention to needs to be perceived and interpreted through our other cognitive structures. So that's what stereotypes are for, and that's what happens when the overgeneralization occurs. What other things happen? What other features of stereotypes are there? Well, they're generally speaking negative ones. And they're usually applied from people with more power in the society to people with less power in the society. Okay. Those in power don't need to individuate those without power. It's just you get all lumped together. The dynamic that we'll have in this class is teacher and students in the class. As the teacher, I have the power in this dynamic, and therefore I can clump all students together. I won't do that for you all, of course. But then the president and the population. So the president has the power. He's the individual, or she's the individual. Fingers crossed someday soon. And then the president, and then they can view the population through this gigantic general lens. Okay. Stereotypes, generally speaking, contain wide agreement about the content. It's important to note that there's not wide agreement with the content of stereotypes. Okay. They are difficult structures to modify. They're difficult beliefs to change. If you find enough instances of counterexamples, then you have the opportunity to reorganize your thinking. But then the question is, how many instances of counterexamples is that? That's a hard question to answer because it's going to be different for every single person. Okay. And there are issues when you use the stereotype to the exclusion of all available information. So a good XKCD comic that illustrates this in just 2 very succinct panels. 2 dudes doing math. One of them says, "Wow, you suck at math." And then in the second panel, it's a man and a woman, ostensibly. And it says, "Wow, girls suck at math." And that's probably a stereotype you've heard before. You've probably heard that one before. And I'm really would be really sad if you tell me that came from a teacher of yours. Whether you are a man or a woman, if a teacher said this to you, oh my gosh, that breaks my heart. Because it's not true. It's entirely not true, right? And so that's when you use the stereotype to the exclusion of all available information. Of course, we don't have a lot of information just in this image, but it's probably not due to this character's gender issues related to that. It's probably not. There's no way it is. Okay. John Barge is a famous social psychologist. He said stereotypes are categories that have gone too far. Okay. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Okay. So where does our knowledge come from? Well, the first explanation that I want to give you is called the kernel of truth hypothesis. The kernel of truth hypothesis. And this was developed by Gordon Allport in the mid-20th century. Okay. So the idea is kernel of truth. And we're talking like a corn kernel. And if you're from or in Illinois right now, you know what corn is. Corn kernel. So it's a tiny little grain of truth, right? So even in cases which there is the kernel of truth, the stereotype leads to the unjustified jump beyond descriptive differences to assumptions about essential differences in traits and abilities. Okay. For example, one commonly held stereotype in the United States is that African Americans are poor. Although it is true that African Americans overrepresent all people that live below the poverty line in the United States, the vast majority of African Americans actually live above the poverty line. That may have shifted somewhat in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years, but I would say it's generally true. But the stereotype is still that African Americans are all poor, which is entirely not the case, as far as statistics will tell you. So even in kernels of truth, the stereotype might not even come from the world. The social reality might come from the stereotype, like we talked about in a previous video of confirmation bias and the self-fulfilling prophecy. And even if there is a kernel of truth in the stereotype, you're still applying the generalization about a group to an individual, which is always incorrect. Always. And that is from John Barge again. Okay. The second way that stereotype knowledge comes into our beliefs is through socialization or social learning. I mentioned this when we were talking about the self. So you don't have to be wrong in your head. You don't have to have some sort of mental disorder to be prejudiced, right? We're going to get into prejudice in the next video. The whole, recently racist activities that are happening all across the country in the United States couldn't have just been because people are sick. Okay. So again, oversimplification, right? So how does that spread? I'm sure you've heard of hate being taught, right? I'm sure you've seen that that people, generally speaking, act like their parents because we learn from our parents. Okay, and then this stuff gets reinforced by mass media and popular culture. Okay. Oh, parents. Oh, schools. Yeah. And then media, pop culture. Woo! Especially schools. Schools perpetuate stereotypes, and they don't even realize, well, maybe they do, but from my perspective, they likely don't even realize that they're perpetuating stereotypes. And so you get to the situation where you're learning something in school, and it's like, wait, this isn't what actually is. This is not what it was like or what it should be. And so, and then people in those schools then reinforce those stereotypes. All right, additional features of this is, so the third one that I want to talk about is the stereo content model. Fisk, this is from Fisk. And then the data that I'm going to show you is from a study Fisk and colleagues in 2002. So according to this model, the stereotypes we have of different groups can range along 2 dimensions, and those dimensions are competence and warmth. Okay, and we have different emotional reactions to different types of groups. Okay, so we have 2 continua here. We have competence, so low, high, warmth, low, and high, and these are just a couple of them. This is not an exhaustive list, but when you have a group of people that have low competence and low warmth, then generally the emotion that the observer expresses is disgust. And so who are the people that are then we then disgusted by? Well, people who are homeless or addicted to substances. Okay. High competence and low warmth. Well, then we have feelings of envy and jealousy with those people. Okay, so those are the 1%. And those are other professionals like lawyers or Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, right? And he's both of them, right? He's highly competent. He kills people and gets away with it, but he's not very warm. If we have low competence but high warmth, the emotion, generally speaking, is pity. And those are for the elderly and disabled individuals in our society. High competence and high warmth. Students, so pride is generally the emotion that is felt. Pride. So students, we're very proud of our students. And then people who are identified as Americans, or the caricature of American, I suppose. Right? High competence, high warmth. Although I wouldn't agree with that now, and I'm thinking that these quotation marks are actually pretty important. Okay, so this is where stereotypes come from: just competence and warmth. How competent is that person? How engaging? How connected can we be? How warm is that person? How inviting is that person? How nice is that person? That sort of thing. Okay. My friend and colleague, Dr. Angela Bell, studies the stereotype content model, and she has some good stuff. So I definitely recommend taking a look at her work. The fourth thing that I wanted to talk about is the illusory correlation. So this is sort of like kernel of truth. Okay, so the idea here is that, and this is from David Hamilton and his research group from the mid 20th century. So this is the tendency to assume an association between two rare occurrences, such as being in a minority group and performing negative actions. So the illusory part is the assumption that two rare occurrences are connected. So that's the correlation. That's the connected part, the relationship, the association. That's the correlation. Okay. So when in-group members see out-group members acting negatively, a doubling distinctive perception results in exaggerated perception of a correlation. This occurs even when the minority group is no more likely than the majority group to engage in this negative behavior. So pause it here if you want to take a look at each of these mostly negative or meant to be embarrassing stereotypes that somebody collected on the figures that are used for restrooms and such. And I think I think you could probably identify which one is which, even though there aren't any words. I think that's pretty that's pretty insane. And most of these are illusory. There might be a kernel of truth associated with them. See, I'm using terms now. There might be a kernel of truth associated with them. But again, if you are taking that one kernel and applying it to everyone, you're going to have problems. You're going to have a bad time. And the last couple that I want to mention, use of resources. So one of the reasons why kernels of truths or illusory correlations are so powerful, for example, is the idea that we're cognitive misers. And so these all stereotypes represent a bias, which is pretty much the human existence is bias. Okay, so we automatically characterize people to be cognitively efficient. We did that and we do that as an evolutionary adaptation. Okay. And biases are then subject to additional strains or issues because we make more errors when we are busy, when we are tired, or when we are feeling emotional, or we're overstimulated. Okay. And so we can go back to a dual process model, something I've mentioned in previous videos. This one specifically from Divine. Stereotypes are automatically activated. Controlled processes then have to refute or ignore, but only if the person is motivated and able to do so. And so thus we are less likely to do if we are busy, tired, emotional, or depleted, like we talked about with self-regulation and self-control. Okay. Categorization. Outgroup homogeneity is an example that I like to give with this one. So outgroup is they are all alike. We in the in-group are all individuals. Okay. And so the consequence of this is unanimity brings us to overestimations, and it comes with the baggage of own race bias, for example. So if we were talking about in-group versus out-group on race, own race bias ends up being the issue there. Okay. Outgroup homogeneity is the term that I want you to know. So the perception of them as all the same. They're all the same. We're diverse, as I mentioned. Okay. All right. And then I think this is the last one. This is the last one. So information search and memory is the last one. Sometimes we can't find information, and so whatever is accessible to us is what we tend to remember. And stereotypes become memorable for their, and then they become more accessible, and thus we use them more often because they're easier to retrieve. Right. So that's how information search and memory. The last one is attribution. I thought there was this wasn't the last one, but it is the last one. That information search and memory was the last one. My bad. So, for example, attributions about the just world and the just world phenomena or just world hypothesis. The idea that the world is fair. But if you take a look at the ladder, if there are a bunch of people on the ladder, well, the person at the top of the ladder is going to be like, yeah, man, this world is fair. And then the people below them on the ladder are having more and more difficulties because more people are above them on the ladder. And thus, when we look down the ladder, we start to then victim blame. And then victim blaming comes with a lot of stereotypes. So how do we apply stereotypes? How do we apply them? I have 5 applications. Okay. Stereotypes are cognitive tools for simplifying everyday life. Okay. Stereotypes justify prejudices. A justification suppression model. People endorse and freely express stereotypes in part to justify their own negative affective or emotional reactions to outgroup members. Number 3, stereotypes help justify violence, discrimination, dehumanization, infrahumanization, and sexual objectification against outgroups. So dehumanization is to essentially hold views of the outgroup members as animals rather than humans, and language is associated with that. Infrahumanization, which is slightly different and probably a term you haven't heard of. This is the idea where you remove human qualities from the outgroup. So you take away things that are unique to human beings, such as language, rational intelligence, and complex social emotions. So infrahumanization removes those things from that person. So you think that they're incapable of doing such. Okay. Number 4, stereotypes justify the status quo, which then feeds status quo bias. We don't like things changing. Number 5, stereotypes are self-esteem boosters. They are self-esteem boosters. They make us feel better, especially since I said most of the stereotypes we use to be harmful, whether it's overtly or inadvertently or even covertly harmful, they still come from a place of power to a place of lesser power. And so when that happens, we feel better about ourselves if we are the person using the stereotype rather than being the receiver of the stereotype. Now, when do they come into play? What are the situations that they come into play? So first and foremost, lots of times stereotypes are implicit and automatic categorization processes. Okay. And when they become a belief and they become more accessible, then it's just automaticity over and over and over again. So a person is generally speaking initially categorized as belonging to a particular group, either explicitly or implicitly. They may tell you, I am from Los Angeles. I'm an Angelino. Okay. Or you implicitly categorize them. Hey, that guy's like a West Coaster or something. Okay. In your head. Okay. And then either by social learning or justification through the media and exposure to the media, what have you, wherever the source of the stereotype is, that gets activated. Okay. So you categorize, get group, the group ideas. You may have some ideas pinging about West Coasters and Angelinos, maybe. And so those things are activated, and now you're thinking about them. And then those cognitions bleed into effective judgments, which is then prejudice, which is in the next video. And then you either act against those prejudices or you act with those prejudices. Stereotypes exacerbating biases. Well, stereotypes influence how ambiguous behaviors and information is interpreted, which then leads to a connection, the co-occurrence of events. Okay. And then we get what's called the ultimate attribution error, which is kind of like the fundamental attribution error, but this is the ultimate. This is the end-all be-all attribution error. So this occurs when people believe outgroup members' bad actions occur because of internal dispositions. That's how it's related to FAE. And their good actions occur because of the situation. Okay. So it's kind of like a blend of the fundamental attribution error and self-serving bias, but applied to the other, meshed together. And then you get linguistic in-group bias, which influences how those behaviors are described. And this bias is the tendency to describe stereotypic behaviors, positive in-group, negative out-group, in abstract terms, while describing counter stereotypic behaviors, so negative in-group, positive out-group, in more concrete terms. So that's the in linguistic in-group bias, which changes the way people think about those things. And so that's how things are attended to, encoded, and then remembered, which becomes self-confirming. Woo! That's a lot. That's a lot. All right. So let's end this video with talking about the consequences. So, and this is specifically for the consequences of the target, and we're going to specifically talk about stereotype threat. Now, stereotype threat has recently been a topic of replicability discussions. And so some stereotype threat research has not replicated the same way that this research came out in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Okay? But your text still talks about it, and so thus I'm still going to talk about it. Okay? It's probably a phenomenon that occurs under certain circumstances. Okay? So what is stereotype threat? It's anxiety caused by fearing, confirming a negative stereotype of one's own group. Girls sucking at math, for example. So if you are a girl and you are now faced with math, the stereotype threat is that, well, I'm going to suck at math and thus perform poorly, because then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay. So the effects of a stereotype threat. So this is a race stereotype threat. Okay. This is a study in which black folks and white folks solved SAT problems. And in this threat condition, the participants were reminded of race effects on the SAT. Oh, Black Americans do more poorly in general than white Americans do on the SAT. That would be a basic stereotype threat reminder. Okay. And then this other group here is they got no such disclaimer about solving the SAT problems. And you can clearly see a significant drop among the black participants in this study. Black participants in this study versus virtually no difference among black and white participants when there was no stereotype threat. So where does stereotype come from? Well, it's potentially from what's called attributional ambiguity. This is the psychological state of uncertainty, not aversion, uncertainty about the cause of a person's outcome or treatment. And so it can be experienced with regard to one's own outcomes or treatment or those of another person, and with regard to a positive as well as negative outcomes or treatment. It occurs whenever there's more than one plausible reason for why a person was treated in a certain way or received the outcomes that they received. So, is it because I suck at SAT problems, or is it because of something else like my race? Just, I'm speaking broadly, right? So, is negative feedback racism? Well, it depends on what part of the system and what aspect you are talking about, right? It could totally be. Is positive feedback sympathy? Like, this is attributional ambiguity. We don't really know in a situation what could potentially be the reason when there are a number of plausible explanations for how things played out. So that's the end of this video. Please leave your comments, suggestions, and feedback. Wow, I don't know why I do that. Feedback down below. Come up with those questions about this one, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.